I didn't know my life was about to split into a before and an after the night my uncle tried to force his way into my apartment. 3 weeks earlier, my grandparents had sat me down at their kitchen table and told me they had rewritten their will. My grandmother slid a glass of water toward me like she was preparing me for bad news. My grandfather's hands were steady, but his eyes weren't. He said they'd watched the company, our family's construction and real estate business, bleed under the wrong kind of attention. He said they were done pretending it was an accident, and then he said the words that still echo in my chest. You're inheriting the majority of it, the shares, the assets, the responsibility. I didn't celebrate, I didn't cry, I just nodded, like I'd been handed a box that might explode if I shook it too hard. My Uncle Craig didn't know yet, at least not then. The night he found out, I was home alone, folding laundry I didn't care about and pretending my phone wasn't a grenade waiting to go off. It was almost 11 when the knocking started. Hard, angry, the kind that doesn't ask. I didn't open the door. I called out. No answer. The knocking turned into something heavier, something that made the frame shudder. My heart started doing that hollow, echoing thing it does when fear gets ahead of thought. I called the police with one hand and my dad with the other. While the dispatcher kept me talking, I heard the door crack, not open, just break. The sound was sharp, final, like a decision being made without me. I locked myself in the upstairs bathroom and sat on the floor with my back against the tub, listening to footsteps downstairs and the sound of glass giving up. I remember noticing my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't keep the phone still. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should have replaced the batteries in the hallway light. When the police arrived, they found my uncle sitting on my couch, staring at the mess like he didn't recognize it, or himself. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't about money. It was about a family that had been breaking long before my door did. Before my uncle became the man who broke my door, he was just Craig. My dad's younger brother. The loud laugh at family lunches. The one who always had an opinion, always had a story, always had a way of making himself the center of a room without ever doing the work that held the room together. And before all of that, before wills and lawyers and police reports, there was the company. My family owns a mid-sized construction and real estate company that's been around for about 40 years. In our city, people know the name. Not because it's flashy, but because it's been steady. The kind of company that builds things you can point to, apartment blocks, small commercial spaces, renovations on old buildings that needed someone patient enough to do it right. My grandfather, Gerald, built most of it in the 80s and 90s. He's 78 now. Even in retirement, he still carries himself like a man who remembers every nail he ever hammered into place. He doesn't talk about legacy in a sentimental way. For him, legacy is payroll, contracts, reputation, a business that lets families eat. About 15 years ago, he handed the day-to-day to my father, Martin. My dad is 56. He's not the type to charm a room, but he's the type to keep a room from collapsing. He held the company steady for years, kept clients, kept contracts coming in, kept the name clean. I'm his only child. My mom, Susan, passed away 4 years ago. She had a heart condition that worsened over time, and for the last 2 years of her life, hospitals became normal. Machines, nurses, waiting rooms that smelled like coffee and disinfectant. My dad and mom weren't on good terms at the end. They'd been separated for about 3 years before she died, and I lived with her during that period. If my father's world was concrete and contracts, my mother's world was people. She was the one who saw me, not as an extension of the business, not as the only child who will come back someday, but as a girl with her own mind. She encouraged me to study graphic design. She liked that I could make something out of nothing, turn blank space into meaning. I left for college out of state at 18. A decent program, a new city, a life that didn't smell like sawdust and stress. My dad didn't fight me openly, but he never hid what he expected either. At family dinners, he'd casually bring up the company. You'd be good at marketing for us, he'd say, like he was complimenting me. Or he'd send articles about construction trends or ask questions about quarterly reports as if I'd magically learned that language somewhere between typography classes and freelance gigs. And I never told him the truth. I never said, I don't want it. I just changed the subject, smiled, dodged, the way you do when you love someone but don't want to disappoint them. On the other side of the family was my Uncle Craig, 53. Craig had 2 kids, Derek, 28, who was quiet and stayed out of everything, and Mia, 26, my cousin, my closest friend in that branch of the family, the one person who could tell me the truth without turning it into a weapon. Mia and I had been close since we were kids. When my parents were struggling and my mom moved into her own place, Mia would come over during summers. We'd sit in the living room with cheap snacks and watch reality TV, pretending we didn't notice the tension in the adults' voices. She was the kind of girl who listened more than she spoke, the kind who noticed things. Craig, on the other hand, was always around the company without ever belonging to it in a real way. He didn't have a defined role for years. He'd show up to meetings, talk over people, offer opinions like they were contributions. My grandfather let him, partly because Craig was his son, and partly because Gerald hates arguing with his children in front of outsiders. To my grandfather, family conflict is something you swallow, not something you perform. So Craig existed on the edges, not bringing in clients, not managing projects, not carrying responsibility, just orbiting. And that orbit turned dangerous when my grandfather's health started slowing him down. About a year and a half ago, Gerald began having health issues, not life-threatening, but enough that he couldn't be in the office every day. He moved slower, his energy dipped, his patience got thinner. My dad was still running things, but Gerald wanted another set of eyes around. So Craig started showing up 5 days a week. It wasn't announced like a promotion. It was framed as help. Family stepping in, keeping things smooth. But the moment Mia texted me, "Craig's in the office every day now," my stomach tightened in a way I couldn't explain. Because deep down, I already knew. Craig didn't step in because he cared about the company. He stepped in because he saw an opening. And I was still far away, building my own small life, freelancing, paying rent, stretching the small amount of money my mom left me like it was fabric that could tear if I pulled too hard. I didn't understand then that everything was already shifting under my feet. I just thought my biggest problem was whether my next client would pay on time. I didn't know the real problem was waiting in my family's foundation. Quiet at first, like rot. And rot doesn't announce itself until the floor caves in. It all started small, like it always does. A missed call, a strange email, something that didn't quite sit right in the pit of my stomach, but I brushed it off. When I first noticed Craig's increasing presence at the company, I thought it was just a phase. My grandfather was slowing down. My dad was recovering from his accident, and maybe it was just easier for everyone to let Craig help. After all, he was family, right? But as the weeks passed, things began to change in ways that weren't easy to ignore. The first sign was when Craig started canceling long-term contracts. I didn't even know about it at first. My dad was still recovering from the car accident, and I didn't want to burden him with details that might stress him out more. But when I visited Gerald one Sunday, he casually dropped it into conversation. "You heard about the contracts Craig canceled, right?" Gerald asked, as if it was a passing thought. "No, what happened?" I replied, my voice tight. "They weren't bringing in enough revenue," he said simply. Craig said the margins were too low. I felt my stomach lurch. These contracts had been steady work for years. Not glamorous, but reliable. They kept the reputation of the company intact. My dad had worked hard to maintain those relationships with clients. I remember sitting in that old, worn armchair in my grandfather's living room, staring at the dim lighting that used to be so comforting, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't even have to ask how it had affected the company's cash flow. Gerald's face said it all. But Craig's mistakes didn't stop there, not even close. The second sign came when my dad finally returned to work after his long recovery. His body was still frail, but his mind was sharp. As soon as he returned to the office, he noticed the second red flag. Craig had signed a new contract with a developer he'd known personally. On the surface, it seemed like a good move. But within 2 months, the company was chasing payments from that developer, and our own workers hadn't been paid in weeks. I found out about it from Mia, who'd been the one to watch it all unfold from the sidelines. She had always been perceptive, and she told me everything. The phone calls from angry contractors, the missed payments, the tense meetings that no one talked about once they were over. I had seen it coming, but I still felt the weight of disbelief pressing down on me as Mia spoke. "It's all falling apart," Mia whispered one afternoon when I called her. "Dad's not even fighting him anymore. Craig's still here, and everyone's just pretending like it's fine." I wanted to believe that Mia was exaggerating, that it was just a phase. But then the meetings started happening, more and more frequently. Gerald and my father would sit in the office, arguing in low voices, Craig would be in the corner, avoiding eye contact, acting like he wasn't the cause of all this tension. But I saw it in the way my dad's shoulders hunched, in the way Gerald looked at his son with a kind of disappointment that couldn't be hidden anymore. There was a heaviness in the air that hadn't been there before, a heaviness I couldn't ignore. I had no idea how bad it had gotten until Mia sent me a text one evening, a message I'll never forget. "Grandpa's starting to call me every day. He says he doesn't trust Craig to make decisions anymore." I couldn't believe what I was reading. Gerald had always been the silent pillar of strength, the man who wouldn't show his frustration unless it was absolutely necessary. If he was reaching out to Mia, things had escalated far beyond what I'd imagined. So I did what I thought I should do. I went to visit. It was a regular Sunday dinner. Ruth, my grandmother, cooked the usual roast. Gerald was quiet as always, but when dinner was halfway through, he dropped the bombshell. "We've decided to update the will," he said, and just like that, my life changed. I didn't know it at the time, but the decision to include me, to leave me the majority of the assets, was his way of trying to protect what was left of the family business. He didn't want to say it outright, but the message was clear. The company had become a battleground. And Craig, the very person who'd been handed power by Gerald, had torn it apart. The silence in the room was thick. My grandfather didn't speak further, but Ruth's eyes darted nervously between me and my father. It was like they were all waiting for me to react. But the truth was, I was too stunned to respond. All I could think about was the mess Craig had made, and how my life was now inextricably linked to that mess. What had once been a quiet, stable life was quickly becoming a chaotic storm, and I had no idea how to navigate it. That dinner, the one where my grandfather casually dropped the news about the will, marked the beginning of the end for everything I thought I knew about my family. The shock of hearing that I was inheriting the company was still settling in when Craig finally found out. The way he reacted, it wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, something primal. It was like his entire world had collapsed and I was the one holding the wrecking ball. The first confrontation came at a family lunch a few weeks later. It was a quiet Sunday, the kind where everyone gathers at Ruth's house pretending things are normal. It wasn't the kind of event where news should be dropped, but Gerald did it anyway. Ruth, with her calm, steady demeanor, simply stated the change in the will as though it was no big deal. Craig, for a moment, looked like he hadn't heard her correctly. He asked her to repeat it, and when she did, his face went red. The veins on his neck pulsed with tension. My father, usually calm, kept his eyes trained on his plate. He didn't speak. His silence was louder than anything he could have said. And then Craig's voice cut through the thick air. "You've got to be kidding me," he hissed, the words dripping with venom. "After everything I've done for this family, you hand it all over to her? To her?" The way he said "her" made my stomach churn. It wasn't just anger, it was contempt. He wasn't angry at Gerald for making the decision. He was angry at me, as though somehow I had orchestrated it all. I didn't speak. I couldn't. I just sat there staring at the food on my plate, pretending the world hadn't shifted beneath my feet. I felt my hands growing clammy, the heat of shame rising in my chest. This was all supposed to be normal. This was supposed to be a family gathering, but instead it felt like the world was ending in a way I never expected. Mia was the only one who spoke. She slowly raised her glass of water and took a sip, never breaking eye contact with Craig. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it was everything. She was saying what no one else could. We were done with the manipulation. We were done with the lies. Craig didn't back down. His words became louder, more pointed, aimed directly at me. He called me names, accused me of being a golden child who was handed everything without earning it. His voice was shaking with rage. He didn't stop until Ruth snapped. "Enough, Craig." Ruth's voice cut through the chaos. "This isn't about you anymore. It's about what's left. And if you don't stop, you'll have nothing left. Do you hear me?" The silence that followed was deafening. Craig stared at his plate, his face a mask of humiliation. He looked like he wanted to say something, but he couldn't. He didn't. He just glared at me, the tension in the room thick with the things left unsaid. That night, I went home and sat in my apartment in the dark, just thinking. The conversation kept playing in my head over and over, each word from Craig a thorn, each silence from my father a wound that wouldn't heal. I knew that things had shifted. Not just in the will, not just in the company, but in the way we all saw each other. And I realized in that quiet, dark moment that the storm wasn't coming. It had already arrived. The days following that lunch felt like walking through fog. The air was thick with unspoken tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that my family was splintering right before my eyes. Craig had made his feelings clear, and though I hadn't said much during the confrontation, the weight of his words was still crushing me. It was hard to breathe, hard to think, with the thought that someone I once looked up to could harbor such hatred for me without any real reason. But I couldn't let that paralyze me. The first thing I did was call Mia. She answered immediately, her voice steady, though I could tell from the faint shakiness at the edges that she was just as rattled as I was. "I know it's hard," she said, her words measured, "but you need to stand your ground. This isn't your fault. You didn't cause any of this." Her words gave me a brief sense of relief, but it was fleeting. The reality of what was happening in my family was too much to process. This wasn't just about money or assets. This was about trust, betrayal, and the years of manipulation that I had ignored. Craig had wormed his way into every family gathering, every meeting, and I had never questioned it. Now that I could see it clearly, I felt like a fool. But even worse, I felt like I was stuck. I had to deal with the fallout of my grandfather's decision, of the company's future, and I had to decide what kind of person I was going to be in the midst of this mess. I couldn't run away from it. I couldn't turn my back on my grandfather's wishes, no matter how conflicted I felt about them. The truth was, I had been given an opportunity, a chance to rebuild something that had already been broken. But how could I do that when everyone around me seemed hell-bent on tearing it all down? I needed answers. I needed to confront my father. That night, after the tension from the family lunch had settled into something more like dread, I drove to my dad's house. I wasn't sure what to expect from the conversation, but I knew I couldn't keep avoiding it. I needed to hear it from him. Why had he let this happen? Why hadn't he done more when he saw it all falling apart? My dad greeted me at the door with that familiar quietness, the same silence that always seemed to fill the space between us. The kind that wasn't about coldness, but about the weight of everything unsaid. We sat down in the living room. I didn't know how to start, but I had to. "Dad," I began, my voice tight with emotion, "I don't understand. Why didn't you stop him? Why did you let Craig destroy everything?" He didn't immediately answer. His hands, which were usually so steady, rested nervously on his lap. He looked at me, and for a moment, I saw the same helplessness in his eyes that I'd seen in my grandfather's. "I didn't know how," he said, his voice low. "I've spent years trying to protect this family, protect you. But Craig, he has a way of making things his own, and I didn't want to fight him, not with everything that was going on with my health, not with everything you had to deal with your mom. I just couldn't." He trailed off, the words hanging in the air like a confession that had been buried for too long. I wasn't angry with him, not really, but I was disappointed. My dad had always been the rock, the one who held things together, but it felt like he had stepped aside when his own brother started to tear things down. I wasn't sure if it was out of fear or resignation, but it didn't matter now. The damage had been done. "I don't want to be part of this," I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. "I don't want to take on the weight of the company and all its failures. Not when Craig's still running around, making decisions." My dad looked at me, his gaze searching. "I never wanted you to carry that burden. I never expected you to take over the company. But you're the only one left, the only one with a steady head on their shoulders. If we don't do something, we'll lose everything." I couldn't argue with him. I knew that if we didn't act fast, everything would collapse. Craig's mistakes were just the beginning, but I wasn't sure I was ready to jump into the role my grandfather had set out for me. I didn't know if I could, not with everything that was at stake. But I also knew I had no choice. "I'll do what I have to," I said finally. "But I need your help, Dad. I can't do this alone." The look he gave me then was full of something I couldn't quite place. Regret, yes, but also a sense of pride. Maybe it was both. And for the first time, I realized that this wasn't just about the company. This wasn't about Craig or the will or the inheritance. This was about my family, a family that was splintering at the seams, and about me, standing on the edge, deciding whether to stitch it back together or let it fall apart. After that conversation with my father, I felt the weight of the family business pressing down on me. It wasn't just the inheritance. It was the years of damage done by Craig's reckless decisions, the trust that had been broken, and the uncertainty of what the future held. My grandfather's decision had been made, but it felt like no matter how hard I tried to hold it together, things kept slipping through my fingers. I couldn't escape the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control, that we were caught in a storm with no way to steer clear of the chaos. The next few days were a blur of meetings with my lawyer, conversations with Mia, and long nights spent trying to figure out what had gone wrong and what needed to happen next. My dad's involvement in the company had always been passive. He managed, but never with the fierce drive that my grandfather had. And now, with my grandfather's health fading, the weight of responsibility fell squarely on my shoulders. I wasn't prepared for this, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized something crucial. No one else was going to fix this but me. Mia was the only one who understood, who could talk me through the mess with some semblance of calm. She'd been caught up in it too, watching her father and my grandfather struggle with the company's downfall, while Craig continued to play his games in the background. She knew what was at stake. She also knew the stakes were personal. "Mia," I said one evening, after we'd been talking about what to do next, "what if it's too much? What if I can't fix this? I don't want to lose myself in all this responsibility. I don't even know where to start." She was quiet for a long time before responding, her voice soft but firm. "You start by deciding who you are in all of this. Are you just the person who inherits, or are you the one who fixes it?" I didn't answer right away. Could I really fix this? Was I capable of running the business and restoring everything it had lost? My entire life had been a dance around the family business. I was never expected to carry it on. I was never trained for it. All I'd ever wanted was to carve out my own path. And now, that path felt like it was crumbling beneath me. But Mia was right. The question wasn't whether I could do it. The question was whether I could let it all fall apart because I was too scared to try. By the time I had made that decision, the tension had already escalated beyond anything I was prepared for. It happened at another family dinner. This time, it was just the immediate family: my dad, Craig, Mia, and me. I was dreading it, but I knew we had to talk. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken things. I could feel Craig's eyes on me, burning with anger and resentment, as if he couldn't stand the idea of me taking what he thought was his. "You don't belong here," Craig said, his voice low and threatening, his eyes locked onto mine across the dinner table. "This company isn't yours to take. You don't know what it means. You don't understand what it's cost to build it." I tried to stay calm, but the words stung like a slap. I could feel the hot rush of blood in my face. My hands were shaking, but I steadied myself. "I didn't ask for this," I said, my voice steady but with an edge. "I'm not the one who messed it up, Craig. You did." He stood up suddenly, knocking over his chair, and for a moment I thought he might lash out. The tension in the room was unbearable. Mia's eyes flicked between us, and I could see the anxiety in her face, her usual calm replaced by fear. My dad sat there, quiet as always, but his eyes were on me now, full of something I couldn't quite place. Regret? Worry? Craig leaned over the table, pointing at me with a finger that trembled with anger. "You think you're the solution? You think you can just step in and fix everything like it's some easy task? This was never meant for you." Before I could respond, my father finally spoke up, his voice a low growl that I hadn't heard in years. "Enough, Craig." But Craig wasn't listening. He continued, his voice rising. "You think you're so much better than me because Grandpa decided to give you the company, but I've done just as much. More, even. I'm the one who kept things afloat when you were busy with your work." His words dripped with bitterness, but what struck me was the underlying desperation. He didn't care about the company. He cared about winning. At that moment, it became clear to me. Craig wasn't just fighting for his share. He was fighting to control everything, to win. And if that meant destroying the very thing that kept us all connected, then so be it. I had to make a decision. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and locked eyes with Craig. "You've already lost, Craig. You just don't know it yet." I turned to my dad, who was watching me carefully, and said, "I'm taking control. We need to fix this now, not tomorrow, now." As I walked out of the room, I could feel the weight of what I had just said. I wasn't ready, but I had to do it. I had to fix what was broken, for myself, for the company, and most of all, for the future. The following days felt like a battle that no one was prepared for. Every conversation, every decision became a small war, a contest of wills between me and my family, and, in some ways, a fight against myself. I was stepping into a role I never asked for, never expected to inherit, and yet there I was, with the weight of my family's legacy, pressing down on my shoulders like a 100-ton boulder. I tried to maintain control, to keep my cool as the tension escalated. I met with my lawyer, with Mia, and even with my dad, to begin the process of restructuring, to plan for the next steps, and to figure out how to salvage what had been ruined. but it felt like I was pushing a boulder uphill, and every step I took seemed to make the situation more impossible. Then it happened, the breaking point. To check on him, to sit with him and get to check on him, to sit with him and get some peace. He'd been quieter than usual lately, more distant, as if he had given up on something that he didn't know how to fight for anymore. But when I walked into his living room that evening, I could see it in his eyes. It was there, lurking beneath the surface. The guilt, the regret, the frustration that he couldn't undo what had been done. "Grandpa," I said, sitting down next to him, "we're going to fix it. We're going to make things right." He turned to me slowly, his face wrinkled with years of hard work and worry. But there was something new there, something I hadn't seen before, a quiet resignation. "I've tried, my dear," he said softly, his voice heavy with years of disappointment. "I've tried to fix it all my life, but maybe it's too late." The weight as of his words landed on me like a stone. I had been so focused on keeping the company together, on making things right, that I hadn't stopped to realize the true extent of the damage. The business, the family. It was all a house of cards, built on years of mistakes and betrayals. And now the foundation was crumbling beneath me. That night, I didn't know what to do. I felt hopeless, helpless, like I was drowning in something I couldn't control. The guilt that had been bubbling beneath the surface erupted, and for the first time in a long time, I questioned everything. What was I even fighting for? I spent hours in my apartment that night, staring at the walls, going over every conversation, every decision I had made. The company, the inheritance, my family, it all felt like a lie. And as much as I wanted to fix it, I realized something that struck me to the core. I couldn't fix everything. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't strong enough to carry the weight of my family's failures. I wasn't the savior they thought I could be. I was just me. And it was in that dark moment, that point where I had no more answers, that I decided something crucial. I needed to take a step back for my own sanity, for my own future. I wasn't going to let the company or the will or Craig define me. But that decision didn't come easy. It came with guilt, with fear, with the overwhelming sense that I was walking away from something that had been my entire life, something that had defined my identity for years. But I wasn't walking away. I was choosing to stop the cycle, to stop the manipulation, to stop the damage. That was the hardest thing I've ever done, letting go of what was no longer mine to carry. I spent a lot of time in the days following my breakdown thinking about what my grandfather had said. Maybe it's too late. Those words kept ringing in my ears, and I couldn't shake the sense of failure that settled in my chest. I wanted so badly to prove him wrong, to show him that I could fix everything, that I could save the company, the family, the reputation. But the more I tried to push forward, the more I realized that what I was really doing was digging myself deeper into a hole. I wasn't fixing anything. I was just patching over the cracks, pretending that if I worked hard enough, I could somehow restore what had been broken. It was clear now that the company, what was left of it, wasn't the only thing that needed saving. I needed saving too. That's when I had my turning point. It wasn't some grand gesture or dramatic confrontation. It was a quiet conversation with Mia. We met at a small cafe, the kind with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that looked like it had been written by hand. She ordered the same coffee she always did, black, no sugar, and sat across from me with her usual calm demeanor. But I could tell she was worried about me, about everything. "I've been thinking a lot," I said, stirring my coffee slowly, avoiding her gaze, "about what Grandpa said, about Craig, about everything." Mia didn't respond right away. She just watched me, waiting for me to say what I needed to say. Finally, she spoke. "You're not going to save the company. You're not going to fix the past. But that doesn't mean you can't take control of the future." Her words were simple, but they hit me with the force of something much bigger. "I don't know how to let go," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "I don't know how to walk away from this. I don't know who I'd be without it." Mia's gaze softened. "You're not defined by this. You never were. The company doesn't own you, and neither does Craig. You've been carrying all of this because you thought it was your responsibility, but you don't have to carry it anymore." And that's when it clicked. I didn't need to save the company. I didn't need to carry the weight of my family's failures on my shoulders. For the first time in months, I felt the tiniest breath of relief. I could let go. I didn't need to be anyone's savior. I didn't need to sacrifice myself to fix something that was beyond fixing. Mia leaned in, her voice low but steady. You have a future that's yours, not theirs, not anyone else's. You get to decide what it looks like. You don't have to fight their battles anymore. I sat back, letting the weight of her words sink in. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't have to carry the family legacy if it wasn't mine to bear. I didn't have to fix everything that had gone wrong. The decision was mine now. It was time to start living for me. That night, I called my lawyer. It was time to officially step away from the company. I needed to protect myself, my future. I needed to be free from the burden I'd been carrying for so long. I had no idea what the next steps would be, but for the first time, I felt like I had a say in my own story. The next morning, I took a drive. It was a simple thing, just a drive through the city, past familiar streets and places that had once felt like home. I passed the company office, the building where I had spent so many restless hours, and for the first time, I didn't feel a sense of obligation. I felt something else, freedom. When I returned home, I knew what I had to do. I called my dad. He answered on the second ring, his voice tense with worry. "What's going on? Are you okay?" I paused for a moment before speaking, feeling the weight of my decision hanging in the air. "I'm stepping away from the company," I said, my voice steady. "I'm not going to fix it. I'm not going to carry it anymore." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing, and then he spoke. "I understand," he said quietly. "But don't let this tear you apart. You've done everything you can, and you deserve to have a life outside of all this." It was the first time in a long time that I felt like my dad truly saw me. Not as his daughter who had to fix everything, not as the person expected to carry the weight of our family's legacy, but as me. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but think about how far I'd come. I wasn't free yet, but I was on the path to being free, and for the first time in ages, I felt a flicker of hope. The days following my decision felt surreal. I had taken the first step toward freeing myself from the weight of the company and the chaos Craig had caused. But as anyone who has ever taken a major step in their life knows, freedom doesn't come without its consequences. The first person I called after telling my dad was my lawyer. We went over the details of how to officially sever ties with the company, how to ensure my name wasn't tied to any of Craig's mistakes. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be clean. But it was necessary. By the end of the week, the phone calls from the company stopped. The daily emails and constant pressure to manage the fallout from Craig's reckless decisions stopped. My grandfather and my father were still tangled in it all, still watching helplessly as the business sputtered, but I was no longer part of it. The hardest part was the reaction from my family. Craig didn't take it well. Of course he didn't. He wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly, especially when he thought the world owed him something. The first time I saw him after my decision was at a family gathering. The tension in the room was palpable. No one wanted to make eye contact, and every conversation felt like an echo of something unresolved. Craig's gaze found mine from across the room, and for a long moment, we just stared at each other. His eyes burned with rage, but there was something else in them too. Something I couldn't place. It wasn't just anger, it was desperation. It was the fear that he'd lost everything, and now he was grasping at straws to find something to hold on to. "Do you think you can just walk away from this?" he sneered when he finally approached me. His words were sharp, cutting. "You think you can just take what's rightfully mine and leave me to clean up your mess?" I felt a cold rush of calm wash over me. The anger in his voice, the bitterness, none of it mattered. Not anymore. "I'm not the one who ruined everything, Craig," I said, my voice steady and unshaken. "You had your chance. You blew it. Now it's time for me to move on." He took a step closer, his breath coming faster now, like he was trying to intimidate me. But I wasn't scared of him anymore. I had seen through him long ago, and his threats didn't have the same power they used to. "You won't get away with this," he hissed, his words almost desperate. "You think you can just walk away and have a clean slate? That's not how this works. I will make sure you regret this." I met his gaze without flinching. "You're the one who's going to regret it, Craig. You'll never change, and that's why this ended." That was the last conversation I had with him, the last time I allowed his toxicity to affect me. But even as I walked away from him, I felt the sting of guilt, not because I doubted my decision, but because it felt like cutting ties with a part of my family I had once loved. The business wasn't just a company to me. It was tied to my grandfather's legacy, to my father's sacrifices. To leave it behind felt like I was letting go of more than just a job. I was letting go of the last piece of what had once made my family my family. Then came the fallout from the family itself. My dad was the first to reach out. After our earlier conversation, I expected him to understand, but the silence between us was deafening. When he finally called, his voice was softer than I expected. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. His voice cracked with emotion. "I know you're angry, but we've put so much into this company. It's been your whole life." I had to take a breath before responding. It was hard to say it out loud, but I had to. "It hasn't been my life. Not really. I've been living for you, for Grandpa. I've been carrying something that wasn't mine to carry. I can't do it anymore, Dad." There was a long pause. "You're making a mistake, you know," he said quietly, "but I respect your decision. I just wish there was another way." His words hurt, but in a way, they also brought me comfort. My dad had always been the one who carried the weight for the family, who sacrificed for the future, and I had always admired him for that. But now, I realized, I wasn't him. I had to live my life for me. The hardest conversation came next, with my grandfather. I hadn't expected him to understand, not after everything that had happened. But when I finally sat down with him, I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. It wasn't disappointment, it was weariness. "You did the right thing," he said simply. "I've been carrying this burden for so long. I should have let it go a long time ago." I stared at him, unsure of how to respond. This man, who had built everything from the ground up, who had been the rock for our family, was telling me that I had made the right choice. That felt like a weight lifted from my chest. It wasn't the end of the world. It was just the end of a chapter. "I'm sorry for the way things turned out, Grandpa," I said softly, "but I can't live in the shadow of what was anymore. I need to find my own way." He nodded slowly. "I understand. I didn't want it to end this way, but maybe it had to." The aftermath wasn't easy. There were still people who looked at me like I was the enemy. There were still moments where I doubted my decision. But as the weeks went by, I started to feel something I hadn't in a long time: peace. I was no longer bound by the weight of my family's expectations. I was free. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I was excited to find out. I started exploring new projects, reconnecting with my friends, and diving deeper into my graphic design work. I even signed a new client, a big project that was a huge step forward in my career. It wasn't about money or status. It was about me, about carving out a future on my terms. And maybe that was the greatest lesson of all. As the months passed, life began to take on a different rhythm. The chaotic whirlwind of family drama, legal battles, and corporate chaos slowly faded into the background, and I found myself building something entirely new. The weight of the past was still there, lingering at the edges of my consciousness, but I was learning to breathe again, to let go of the expectations that had held me hostage for so long. I continued my work as a freelance graphic designer, and it flourished. I picked up bigger projects, clients who truly valued my creativity and vision. Every contract, every design was a small victory, a testament to the fact that I could succeed on my own terms without the shadows of the company or family drama looming over me. One of the most important things I did was to finally confront the fear that had held me back for so long. For years, I had been living in the margins of my family's business, caught in a web of responsibilities that weren't truly mine to carry. But stepping away from it felt like stepping into my own life for the first time. I no longer defined myself by the legacy of others. I wasn't the person who had to fix everything. I was just me. There were still difficult moments, days when I questioned my decision, days when I missed the comfort of being part of something familiar, even if that something had been broken for years. But I learned to accept that healing wasn't linear. Some days, I'd feel strong and clear-headed, ready to take on the world. Other days, I'd feel the sting of the past, and that was okay. What mattered was that I was moving forward. The relationship with my dad was one of the slowest to heal. We still had our moments of silence, those gaps where neither of us knew what to say. But we were learning to rebuild our connection, piece by piece. I saw him trying to be there for me in a way that wasn't defined by obligation or the weight of the company. I didn't need him to understand everything, just to be present in my life, and slowly we got there. Mia remained my closest ally. She was there when I needed someone to lean on, someone who understood not just the business, but the emotional toll it had all taken. And it wasn't just about my family's drama anymore. It was about us, our lives, our futures, the things we had built outside of the chaos that had once consumed us. One day, I realized I was no longer afraid of the future. I had spent so many years thinking that my life was tied to the family business, that my success or failure depended on it. But the truth was, I was the one who had the power to define my future. No one else. Not my dad, not my grandfather, and certainly not Craig. I began to think about my own legacy, not one tied to a company or a family name, but a legacy of my own choosing. I wanted to be remembered for the person I had become, not the roles I had played in the lives of others. I wanted to build something that had meaning to me. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I decided to move. I sold my apartment, the place where so many of my decisions had been weighed and measured. I moved into a new space, one that felt like a blank canvas. There were no old memories clinging to the walls, no echoes of the past haunting the rooms. It was just me, ready to build something new. The lessons I learned were hard-earned, but they were worth it. I realized that I could be strong without being weighed down by the past, that walking away wasn't failure. It was the first step toward freedom. And that true peace comes not from external achievements, but from finding inner balance and being true to who you really are. I don't know what the future holds, but I know it will be mine, and that's enough. Lesson learned. Sometimes letting go is the only way to truly move forward. The things you think are your responsibility might just be the things holding you back from the life you were meant to lead. And with that, I'm ready for whatever comes next.